Good afternoon, everyone. So in today's webinar, we're going to be exploring the growing role of nature-based solutions in driving climate adaptation. So with the rising demand for nature-based solution projects and the increasing risk of climate-related hazards, when we have an adaptation financing gap of between 194 and 366 billion US dollars per year, this is obviously a topic that is both promising and complex as well. So we will be discussing today how the drivers for nature-based solutions and the scale of the benefits that they can have for people, climate and nature are what make them so compelling for adaptation and long-term resilience. But we'll also be looking at the barriers to using NbS as a method of adaptation, as whilst the complexity of ecosystems means that the impacts they can have can be broad and diverse. It also means that the outcomes can be unpredictable and often harder to measure, opening up the potential for greenwashing. So one of the reasons we're discussing this today is that Gold Standard is currently piloting an adaptation framework that was developed over the last 2 years with Resilient Cities Catalyst. And part of this work is better understanding how we can drive finance for adaptation from both the public and the private sector. And as such, we're now exploring how our stakeholders can utilise integrated solutions as to drive greater impact as well. So before we delve into the discussion, I think because this is a complex topic with often disputed or misinterpreted terminology, it's important to clarify a few definitions before we get started. So in terms of adaptation and resilience, they are often used interchangeably, but whilst they are obviously related, they are also fundamentally different as well. And adaptation is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects, whereas resilience is sort of the capacity of social, economic and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend. And this can be achieved through adaptation, so reducing the risk to these systems from climate hazards by responding or reorganising in ways that maintain their essential function, identity and structure. And our adaptation framework defines risk as the probability of a negative impact occurring. And this probability is determined by assessing the hazard probability, the vulnerability, and the exposure of parties to a climate hazard, which you can see from this risk triangle here. So hazard probability is the potential occurrence of an event or trend that may cause negative impacts. The exposure is the level of contact with a hazard event or trend, and the vulnerability is the tendency to be negatively affected by a hazard or trend, so this includes the social aspect of impact here. Now, in terms of nature-based solutions, this is obviously very critical and crucial to understand this definition. And I think this is something that we'll touch on a lot more in the discussion as we go on. So nature-based solutions are defined as the actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously benefiting people and nature in an integrated manner. And this is crucial that it's a solution that is driving multiple benefits for both people and nature. But if we look at natural climate solutions, these are the actions to protect, better manage and restore nature to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and store carbon. So similar to nature-based solutions, but where the focus of NbS is on addressing multiple societal challenges, the primary focus of natural climate solutions is on climate mitigation. So just a quick introduction there, so we're all on sort of a level playing field. I will now introduce our excellent panel of experts that we have joining us for the discussion today, each with a passion for nature-based solutions and adaptation that they're going to bring to their respective fields here. So we have Natalie Gartman joining us. She is leading on environmental social governance, ESG, and impact at Pegasus Capital Advisors. Pegasus are an innovative impact investing firm focusing on climate solutions in both adaptation and mitigation, as well as nature-based solutions in the global south. And they're one of few investors that are really committed to moving from ESG to measuring and monitoring real, credible impact outcomes from their portfolio. Then we have Sundar Bharadwaj. the CEO and co-founder of TerraGreen, a private sector enterprise cultivating and operating large biodiverse agroforests, looking to create positive social, environmental, and economic change through the implementation of nature-based solutions and adaptation into the design of its projects. The first of which is actually a gold standard design certified project, which is located in Mpumalanga in South Africa. And then next we have Shail Joshi, a senior program officer for nature-based solutions at WWF, World Wildlife Fund, with a background in environmental planning, and he's also leading the climate adaptation work on WWF's Asia portfolio, looking into how to manage and protect ecosystem services, including through coral reef conservation and linear infrastructure, among many others as well. And then finally, we have John Carstensen, the climate change lead, as well as also being a fellow for climate change at Mott MacDonald, a global engineering management and development consultancy. He's been working in international development and climate resilience for over 30 years now, and offering a lot of obviously very valuable insights from both the private and the public sector point of view. So without further ado, I'd just like to kick off the conversation just by asking Shail, would you mind starting off and just saying, in your own experience, what are some of the unique ways in which you've seen that nature-based solutions can offer an integrated solution for resilient project design?
Thanks, Caitlin and the Gold Standard team for organizing the webinar. It's quite timely, given that we have New York Climate Week occurring just in next week, as well as the COP, both the COPs coming up soon. So that's a great question. And I think broadly, there's growing recognition in nature-based solution and kind of the demand for it that helps these solutions essentially help provide benefits for people, nature, as well as infrastructure that kind of, all the people are reliant on. Specifically under future climate scenarios, these solutions can be quite helpful in not just providing a singular benefit, but multiple benefit, what many people call triple bottom line or resilience dividends. However, unlike many other new ideas, this one itself is slightly misunderstood or has multiple competing definitions in the way it manifests in different projects. So kind of speaking, putting my hat as a representative of a conservation organization, nature-based solutions are not feasible without the component of people in it. Are they providing benefits to people? And are they providing benefits to, quote unquote, the societal challenges as IUCN defines it? And many of these benefits, so which basically raises the question that who is the solution for and for what? So it's important to, one, identify the people, as well as can identify what exactly is the problem we're trying to address here. And by extension, adaptation needs to happen kind of in cognizance with the needs of the people currently, as well as kind of the future needs of the people, and at the same time needs to consider the vulnerability of people, which includes future climate extremes. However, these kind of assessments tend to be slightly difficult, especially at the local level. And specifically, this being a relatively newer concept as compared to mitigation. Unfortunately, it's, as always, kind of seen as a silver bullet. But the more important thing here is to realize that nature-based solutions offer a lot of benefits. But the first and foremost step is to understand, what are we trying to address here? What is the challenge we're trying to address here? So I'll stop there and pass it off back to you, Caitlin, just as the opening remark.
That's great. Thanks, Shail. And John, similar question to you. Would you see that in the same way, that this is how the approach to nature-based solutions should be looked at in terms of adaptation?
Well, with a little bit of a nuance, because I actually believe that we all want nature-based solutions. We're passionate about it. We have seen the light, but unfortunately, what we fail to do in that process, when we're talking to clients, when we're talking to communities and so forth, we are actually not starting off with what ought to be the question, which is, what is the problem you want to solve? So we dive straight in and we say, hey, don't worry, we've got your solution. And we forget to ask, what was your problem? That comes further down the line. And we really, in my view, if we want to be successful in applying nature-based solutions, we really need to flip that on its head and be much more prepared to start off with the question, what is the problem you're trying to address? And then we will be able to pick the solutions that are nature-based from among that menu. It doesn't mean that we're looking at different solutions. It doesn't mean a change in the desire or intensity, but it does mean that we need to ask the question differently when it comes to clients and investors. And I think also we need to recognize, and it's a challenge across an awful lot of adaptation and resilience activities. We all look at this from a holistic point of view. We see the systems connection. We can see that, if we did this, there would be an extra benefit to society, to community, whatever. Again, that is not the starting point for many of the people that, for example, come to us and say, how can you help us? They start off with what is the benefit to them? And the fact that there is another benefit to society, it might be nice, but is not the selling point for them. It is the solution to a specific problem that they have. And then we need to be better to add those, I would say, incremental pieces of information about benefits to society, benefits to community, other benefits that you might get, but you have no benefit. You're not, the investment you're making is not one that benefits from that investment. If we really want to shift the track, we need to change that mindset. And it doesn't mean giving up on our ambition, our intensity, and the desire to find the solutions. It's about framing it.
Right. So we need to start with fixing a problem, not offering a solution straight away without considerations for that. And Sundar, would you say that's the same starting point for you? The what should you do in terms of nature-based? Should you do nature-based solutions? Should you not? Is that the most economic, beneficial mechanism for adaptation and impact?
I tend to agree with what's been already said. In the parts of the world where we are operating at the moment, it has become very obvious about the climate risk to food security and to sustainable community living. And we're seeing that in the last 6 months, we've had forest fires, floods, we've had lots of different challenges. So it's an obvious problem. The challenge is about integrating it into the way people understand it should be done and getting all the stakeholders around it towards making sure that you've got the right level of financing and sponsorship for such projects. People do tend to think that nature-based solutions take a long time, and hence they always consider other mechanisms that they could apply, which is okay and fair, but one needs to have an integrated and a holistic way of looking at this. Not one solution will fit. One has to think of the various things, but the moment you start thinking communities and people's lives and sustainable healthcare and stuff, you start to realize that nature-based solutions offers quite a lot of different aspects to the solution that makes it quite attractive in the long term.
Okay, great. And so another question to pose, Charles, as someone who is working in the conservation sector, what do you see? We've talked about some of the solutions that nature-based solutions and adaptation offer, but what are the barriers that you've experienced to getting finance to flow towards NbS and adaptation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess first thing to put here is that unlike mitigation, adaptation is almost a journey. There is no specific end destination because the circumstances will consistently change. Even if we manage in the next 20, 30 years to stabilize climate, the socioeconomic and political circumstances are constantly going to change, which will mandate the solutions to kind of adapt to those circumstances. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Ironically, that makes it incredibly difficult to implement these solutions, and there are many barriers, as you could imagine. So mitigation, thankfully, we have reached a stage which has clear metrics and targets and standards that we all are trying to kind of achieve, globally speaking. However, adaptation would tend to be quite contextual. It would depend on the people. It would depend on the local regimes. It would depend on the topography, the geography, and several other variables that need to be accounted for. Obviously, this kind of is in itself is a barrier for investment for various investors. The gold standard adaptation framework can provide a good skeleton for different projects to be designed. Having said that, for nature-based solutions, it's incredibly critical to kind of identify the vulnerability of people. Now, vulnerability assessments tend to be rather difficult at local level unless it's very simple, rapid tools are provided. And to Sundar's point about nature-based solutions taking longer time, which is absolutely true, um, because vulnerability assessments are kind of an added step in the design and planning of projects, that in itself becomes a disincentive for project developers, be it governments, be it local nonprofits, or be it the private sector, to undertake those analysis because of added costs. There are a couple of other barriers I'll quickly just mention. One is that we are experiencing through our projects is of kind of political cycles. There's a mismatch between, and there's nothing much can be done about this, between the political election cycles and the amount of time a project requires from planning stages right up to construction. And when those cycles interact with each other, that inevitably creates issues in terms of how those projects are conceived and how those projects are implemented. And the last one, which is critical, and we face that, especially when you're working on nature-based solutions that are at a much larger scale of 100,000 hectares of forest conservation or restoration, land acquisition becomes incredibly important. And that land acquisition, as you can imagine, comes with its own bag of problems, especially when you're trying to deal with communities who are on one side vulnerable, but at the same time need to provide land to kind of implement those nature-based solutions. So that is largely the four odd challenges that we have faced in our work so far, but I'm eager to kind of hear others what they have faced.
Yeah, Natalie, from the perspective of an investor, it'd be great to hear about your reflections on the barriers and also if there are, anything developing in the world that you see to overcome some of the barriers that Charles just pointed out around contextualization and metrics and things like that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and also thanks for convening all of us. So just, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but if you look at climate finance, we see that only 10% currently goes to adaptation. I think the others already mentioned a couple of the barriers that we're facing. John, for instance, mentioned that, and it's the same for investors, taking like a more holistic approach on accounting for the socio-economic benefits that adaptation investments can have. I don't think investors do that enough to a larger extent, but also then taking into account the cost of inaction. So basically taking into account the financial risks that we face if we don't act today, at the same time knowing it's becoming more and more expensive. Like every day we basically don't do anything about it. And that of course has also consequences if we think about climate change and like extreme weather events and droughts and so on, when it comes to health of the people, when it comes to migration flows, when it comes to job losses. So I would argue not being able to potentially quantify all of this and take this into account makes it obviously more difficult to then also convince investors to invest into adaptation projects and solutions. And I think also another barrier that we see is, as also I think Shail mentioned, for instance, it's quite a nascent industry also for investors. I mean, that's also why we have this 10% figure that only flows into adaptation. It's still new, and we also see that the business models, there are great business models out there, there are great opportunities, but we still need to, investors still need to get comfortable what it means. So for instance, the work that Sandra is doing in regenerative agriculture, investors still want to see kind of the proof of concept, the track record that this generates financial returns, of course, alongside the social and environmental benefits. And then I think another point that was mentioned, that also Sha mentioned, the kind of the framework and the standards, and making sure it's, because adaptation it has to be highly contextual, and it has to take into account the local context of communities as well. It's more difficult than in mitigation, and for us, for instance, we piloted the adaptation framework that Gold Standard you guys developed for an ecotourism project in the Galapagos, and it really helped us to combine the science of climate change, but also then, because Gold Standard has this stakeholder inclusive approach, to listen to the local communities, what they've experienced in the past, how they've seen climate change impacting their lives, and taking this into the design considerations. So yeah, I think in terms of what can be done to overcome this challenge, I think like frameworks like you are developing are helpful, proving the business models that can work from financial but also socioeconomic and or environmental perspective, that all helps to overcome. And what I would also argue, there are great innovative financing mechanisms as well out there. So basically, because it's such a nascent industry, to de-risk it for investors to actually enter the investment field of adaptation. So we, for our impact funds, we use blended finance, for instance, which combines concessional with commercial capital, which then makes it more attractive and de-risk the investments if other investors want to come and invest into our funds, for example.
That's great, thank you, Natalie. And Sunda, similar question to you about barriers, but also it'd be great, Natalie just touched upon blended finance as one financial mechanism for resilience. It'd be great to hear your views on sort of what are the actors that should be involved in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I'll touch on a couple of them, building on what's already been spoken about. Now, fundamentally, the financing aspect of it is one of the major challenges typically in NbS, and we've gone through cycles of that for nearly 4 years now. That's largely because traditional financing instruments don't lend themselves to an NbS investment requirement, because most NbS projects require short-term cash investments, but it has long-term benefits, and they don't fit the typical profile of a commercial bank lending money out. So that becomes one problem. The second challenge is when you look at siloed decision-making approaches with policymakers or even with private capital investors, some of them might be looking at land rights separately, others might be looking at infrastructure development, others might be looking at environment management, and an NbS cuts across all of these in an integrated way. So fundamentally, what one has to start to look at, and I think the world's moving towards it when you think about adaptation, because that's the complex nature of it, but it's taking time. And what seems to be like an emerging nascent space has to become mainstream very quickly, because the window around mitigation is probably closing faster, and we have to invest more money into adaptation if we really need to get moving on this. So I'd say those are fundamentally big barriers. The other one, which has been touched upon, is when you look at it from a community or other stakeholders' perspectives, the understanding and awareness of what are the challenges one is faced and how nature-based can support that space is equally important. I think there's a lack of awareness from at least the work we've been doing. We either find scientific communities focused on specific areas, but not broadly considering the challenges where the communities are coming from. But that gap is beginning to close with increased dialogue between parties. The government policymakers, they spend a lot of money on adaptation today, but I think that itself is a barrier because it's not encouraging private capital to come in faster. There needs to be a lot more done from governments to bring or attract private capital into the space. You can't do it without that. So I'll say those are the big ones. If I sum up, they are, traditional finance is not the right way to do this. Secondly, siloed decision makings don't help you. And thirdly, awareness and understanding from communities and other stakeholders makes it more harder. So you've got to cut through all of those.
Thanks, Sundar. So here,
and
Natalie. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, John.
Could I just interject there, because I think that's actually a very important point, Sundar, that and it's a different track almost that we need to look at educating investors and project developers, because we like to get into the project specifics of things. That's how we manage things. But we actually need to educate investors, project developers, communities about system of systems approaches. We cannot continue just to look at the silos and believe that we can solve the problems, but that goes beyond the nature-based solutions, and it's an effort that needs to be made really to educate people about that way of both looking at the world and organizing, because it requires a lot of community engagement and other things, but really putting much greater emphasis on that system of systems approach in everything we're doing.
And John, would you say, just from reflecting on what Sundar and Natalie both said about adaptation being also quite a new field of something that people aren't, they're not investing in it right now, but it's getting there. How do you think that we can leverage what businesses are already doing, like business as usual scenarios in terms of risk management, and get them to go beyond that to actually get to climate resilience? What would you see as the stepping stone there?
I would see two critical issues around that. One is, if we really want to be successful in the resilience and climate adaptation, we need to get beyond the extreme focus on risk management at the moment, because if we want to be successful, we've got to grasp all the opportunities. I'm not saying we should do good risk management. We should. But if we limit ourselves to risk management, we actually limit our thinking and our approach to those wider systems approaches. So, and I think we have probably gone down the route of focusing too much of managing our risks as opposed to achieving the opportunities that lie ahead. So that is one of the key things. Could you just repeat the question, because I had another point that just slipped my mind.
Just the sort of how do we get actors to go from business as usual risk management to get towards doing actual climate resilience and the benefits that come with doing that as well? How do we leverage what we already have?
I mean, that's where the key point is to actually to not constantly fall back on the risk management as the way to address things, and really do good risk management, but add the opportunity side. The other point I had, it will come to me in a second.
No problem. I hope. Feel free to interject when it does. Natalie, a similar question to you. Would you say in terms of what investors are already doing for ESG, environmental, social governance, risk management, mitigation, how have you seen the value of the impact from going from ESG to actual credible quantified outcomes at the project portfolio level?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what John has said. We need to show these opportunities that you can make money alongside the environmental and social benefits to really move the needle and mobilize like the big amounts of capital towards the adaptation sector. And I do think there's like the myth out there that there is not enough pipeline and opportunities that can actually prove that this thesis that we believe in is correct. But we see a lot of great opportunities that address adaptation and resilience. I mean, Sundar can can talk about what the work he's doing in South Africa, but also, for instance, we invested into a company that is called Carbon Wave. They're based in Mexico. And I'm not sure if people in this webinar are familiar with the problem that the Caribbean is facing when it comes to sargassum, which is like this brown algae, so brown seaweed, which is really, it's becoming an environmental but also social issue, because of climate change, so rising ocean temperature, because of nutrient pollution from agricultural practices and so on. There's more and more sargassum blooms, and it ends up at the beach, and as it decomposes, it releases like harmful gases such as hydrogen sulfate, and it also releases arsenic and all the bad stuff that is bad for people, but also for, of course, the marine environment, for instance. So this company found a technology to actually collect the sargassum, but then process it into valuable products such as biostimulants that can be used then in the agriculture sector. They developed the technology for emulsifiers, so for bio-based cosmetic products, and that, for instance, that use emulsifiers, and also vegan leather. So there's a clear business model from, dealing with this big issue due to climate change, and then making actually profits out of a product that they have this amazing technology. So that's just one example, and we see many of those, how we can address the consequences of climate change with a robust business model.
Great. So there are great examples of adaptation and NbS investment pipeline out there.
Caitlin, just coming back to the point I was missing before, because I think following on both from what Natalie said and what Sundar said before, one of the disconnects at the moment is that our societies are not fully recognizing that lack of action on mitigation leads to even greater action needs on adaptation and resilience. There is a very strange part of the political conversation that almost says getting to net zero is optional, and the pace at which we get to net zero is optional. It is not. It comes with a penalty, and it comes with a growing penalty. So the conversation we also need to have is about how we connect the need for urgent mitigation action with the cost associated with building the necessary resilience. And we need to be way more honest about the implications of that. It's not just a choice. It's not something you can defer without a penalty.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even if we do reach net zero, we'll have this 10-year lag where the effects of climate change will be felt anyway, and we'll have to adapt. So both need to be done in duality. Charles, I think you raised your hand if you want to come in there as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of second what John was saying on both his points on risk management as well as the latter, kind of the compounding need for adaptation if we don't actually reach net zero. Having said that, I think for risk management, I guess it's important to make two distinctions here on kind of the managing risks to the project and managing risks to the people or to the beneficiaries. And if we are going, and I'm assuming, John, you were talking about the former, but if you're talking about the latter in terms of managing risks to people, be it future climate risks or any other future risks, then that, to his point, can be leveraged inevitably for, as an opportunity to manage those risks. And that can be forward looking, that can create more benefits than just maintaining the business as usual scenarios. And that's an important distinction to make, which, at least from our experience in the projects we have been doing, tend to get conflated, especially within governments at the federal level, where most times because of large scale funding, the risk management is for the project and less so for the people. And many times managing risk for the project ends up being maladaptive for the people it's trying to kind of serve. So that's an important, and it's more complex than said here, but I think many people will get the point.
That's great. Thank you, Charles. And I think Sundo made the point earlier that, we can't be using traditional financial vehicles solely to be pushing this agenda. But do you think, Charles, that, we need to look at, do you think because private sector will feel the brunt of this first, that they should be the ones taking the lead here? Or do you see that there is a role for other actors in this space as well? So, do you, Charles? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, private sector is incredibly important, obviously. And I guess I tend to think that almost all stakeholders here are critical. And I think one example here is, I think the whole world experienced it, which was COVID. Without the government machinery able to deploy mass scale vaccines in collaboration with the private sector, and in many cases also in collaboration with kind of local nonprofits, kind of encouraging people to go get their vaccines in time, and providing information and sharing that knowledge, that coordination and that triage, without that, I don't think we would have been able to vaccinate so many people. And I think that's a fantastic model for averting or adapting to climate crisis, where no one actor can be, in my opinion, or should be the lead, but rather it's a triage of a bunch of actors depending on the context that they should be working together. And that's pretty much kind of where I stand. Obviously, I think being from a nonprofit, we see the role of nonprofits critical, international nonprofits specifically, but we are more and more within the nonprofit sector as well as outside of it are realizing the importance of forming those intersectoral committees that can run the projects and not kind of a more siloed way of working, to the point John made earlier.
Obviously, traditionally speaking, for adaptation, the majority of the finance has been coming from the public sector rather than the private sector. But John, would you agree with Charles there that we need sort of a dual approach to both, or would you think that the private sector do need to sort of start taking a lead here and investing more?
We're all in this together, but you won't get the investment without really encouraging the private sector to think about these things, and the private sector will. I mean, I come from a company that's embracing this thinking, but so I very much agree that it's a multiple stakeholder approach. It's not sit down and wait for someone to take action. It's all of us in it together, and we really need to encourage, entice, and support each other in doing that, and working together to achieve these outcomes. And Charles, just completely to confirm, I'm not saying don't do risk management. We need to do good risk management, and we need to do lots of it, but we can't stop when we have done a risk management and say, okay, we've assessed the risks, now we're happy. That is not going to bring about the results. So it's not an either or.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think, yeah, it's an important point to make, that obviously investments to increase resilience through adaptation or decarbonisation, it's not necessarily borne by the same people who are going to suffer the consequences. And developing countries, you've seen at COP in the last few years, are increasingly calling out for climate justice in the form of adaptation and loss and damage funds. And with this obviously comes a rise of social metrics and the value that holds as well, which I think is sort of one of my key takeaways from this discussion, I think, is that yes, there is an economic case that can be made for integrated solutions, but the value of having multiple impacts from a singular action isn't just financial, it's in the benefits to society, to health, jobs, migration. And traditionally, we've obviously had a focus of loss and damage on measuring economic loss, but there are obviously many frameworks out there and reports such as our own that we created for that purpose that are starting to include non-economic factors such as cultural loss, social cohesion, quality of health. One example is, I think, is it IIED report that just came out on the comprehensive climate impact quantification. And I think this comes in again into a discussion on what is the difference between this tick box risk management exercise and actual climate adaptation and resilience as well. So that would be my key takeaway, I think, from the discussion. But before we close and go to the panel for their key takeaways, I'd like to get some questions from the audience and open up to the panel to jump in and answer away. I won't say who has to answer, so please feel free to jump in. I think people have been asking questions in the Q&A, and one is, oh, this one's actually for Natalie, potentially. Are any of your investors concerning impact fund for climate adaptation from an insurance sector point of view?
So yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, so the investors into our impact funds are from the insurance sector. So we do have indeed insurance and reinsurance companies that invest into our climate adaptation fund. And I think the reason, of course, insurance plays a key role for adaptation and resilience. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're interested in this topic. And as John and others mentioned, I mean, we're all in this together and everybody plays a key role. And from the private sector, we do see insurance companies stepping up, working with governments as well, and also with private sector investors such as us to create innovative insurance solutions, particularly when it comes to financial inclusion, but also agriculture, in the agriculture sector, to develop insurance solutions that would help better address resilience.
And I think we've got to acknowledge, I mean, clearly insurance approaches are fundamental to the approach to managing our climate risks. But we've got to increasingly acknowledge that insurance is not the full answer. If you have places in the world that are regularly destroyed by fires, by storms, by flooding, you become uninsurable. And that is an issue that is really, really important. And if you no longer are able to insure yourself against a risk that might occur every 6, 8, 10 years, then we need to look at different measures. It's not, I mean, insurance can be helpful in many settings, but insurance only works if there is a level of uncertainty about the level of impact. And if it begins to become certain that you will have a detrimental level of impact, insurance doesn't work.
Great, thank you. Second question is on, in order to actually amplify the need for nature-based solutions in adaptation finance, do you all see that there is the need to make the obvious visible to the public in order to get this financial flow? Does anyone want to take that? Sundar, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I don't know the intention behind that question, because it can be made obvious, but that doesn't solve the problem. The fundamental issue we face here is that the emphasis being laid on investment for adaptation has to increase, and across all quarters of stakeholders. Whether it is effort or money, it doesn't matter. And in my view, yes, it's always good practice and a good transparent way of demonstrating where does the public funds go. And that's always helpful because then you're demonstrating that you're aligning societal needs with the available resources. But that is only one part of the actions that need to be taken. I guess the more important aspect is when funds are allocated, do they reach the right outcomes? We have a much bigger problem around that, which is how do you get the entire ecosystem working together in the most efficient way? And it's early days, very clearly, but it involves project developers, it involves private capital, it involves public policy, involves local municipal stakeholders, communities, NGOs, and there's a huge role required. And I think projects have been indigenously developing their own methods in order to be successful. And we are in need of frameworks that have worked in different parts of the world that can be adapted for such projects. And it's in the fact that one has to learn, listen, and collaborate. I think we have always been open to the idea that stakeholders have a lot more understanding and knowledge from other experiences than us as a project developer. And keeping your ears out open there and listening to various parties is critically important, if not the most important aspect to this. And where we started the project and where we are today, I think it's transformed its journey based on the inputs that have come to us at various points. And we've started to appreciate the benefits of doing projects like what we are doing because it's got a far greater impact on public health, far greater impact on infrastructure spend, far greater impact in terms of even reducing the economic cost of not doing things. And so one would never have appreciated this if you start a project just looking at the 2 or 3 core problems that we were setting out to deliver. So I think this is about collaboration, listening, understanding, calibrating. And yes, funds have to be very transparent, but they also need to be used effectively.
Yeah, and I think that leads very nicely onto the next question that was asked, which is about how adaptation can actually be scaled when the solution, and NbS, I suppose, as well, when the solutions are so locale specific. It'd be great.
Can I start with that? Because
we
are, I do believe nature-based solutions can be scaled up. And one has to draw a clear distinction between the local specific actions and solution that your solution is trying to achieve versus the replicability and the use of those solutions towards the wider good. So there might be differences in terms of the context, whether it is your type of community challenge you're faced, the type of biodiversity degradation you're facing, or the kind of climate risk one is facing, or the public health issues associated with that. However, if you step back from that and think about what are the problems versus what are the abilities from a solution perspective one has, you can draw upon the learnings, the experiences, and recreate the solutions for the specific requirement. You have to make the solution context and local specific, but most of the elements you use in those solutions can be replicable. So one has to be very cognizant of the fact that don't try to create a hammer searching for nails. You actually have to have different hammers for different nails, but you just have to be ready to understand what are you dealing with.
That's a very important point, Sundar, that often we look at scalability purely from a financing point of view, because we like to make things bigger, because that makes the cost of the financing per intervention smaller. And maybe that is not possible to do in this context. But we do need to be better at utilizing, say, artificial intelligence and similar approaches to understand where solutions can be replicated, which is different from scaling it.
So one has to think about just one last point. One has to think of processes that can be replicated, activities that can be replicated, procurement scale one can get, but you can't just scale financing. One has to think through every project. No, absolutely.
Yeah, and just
Sorry.
jumping
Sorry,
in here No, I fully agree with Sundar, what you have just said on replicability. It's important. There's a nuance to it on what exactly you're replicating. If you take a green seawall or a living shoreline, the archetype of that solution can be replicated. But how it would manifest on ground would be more likely than not like chalk and cheese. It'll be completely different in South Africa versus India versus the United States. So that's one point. And there's another question in that, which is about safety nets for maladaptation measures. Now, this is an interesting question. There is no silver bullet or a straight answer here on how to prevent maladaptation for several reasons. Couple of them being adaptation projects are so long that by the time you realize that this particular project has been maladaptive, the funds have run out, the political cycles have changed, the project developers have changed, so on and so forth. It keeps going on. Having said that, there are measures one can put, and there are being recognized more and more as we speak. For example, everyone does an environmental impact assessment EIAs or environmental and social impact assessment ESIAs. But unfortunately, most times those assessments happen much later down in the project pipeline, pretty much after funding and design has been completed, and it's largely done for approval purposes, almost as a checklist. Hence, there's a kind of a growing recognition for SEAS, strategic environment assessments, which occur at the planning stages. Now, if those are currently they're seldom conducted, but if and when the hope is they're conducted more and more often and they're mainstreamed in project development cycles, you could incubate specific adaptive management measures in those assessments and propose those as part of the project design. That as and when project is designed, constructed, implemented, and monitored, there are very specific trigger values, which if the targets are not met, mandates the project developers along with funders to go back to the drawing board to reassess strategies. And that probably is currently the only way to kind of manage risks or basically maladaptation to communities and to kind of the beneficiaries of the project.
That's great. And Natalie, have you got any last reflections on that as well as an investor point of view?
Yeah, maybe to also reflect on what others said. I think at Pegasus, we are actually taking the approach to come in at design stage into a project as an investor and, make sure that the assessments that we conduct, like environmental and social assessments, can lead to outcomes or results that we can still integrate into design. And I think one critical part, which also, Caitlin, you can speak better about it than me, but it's part of the adaptation framework that you developed, you really put emphasis on stakeholder inclusivity and making sure that part of that process, you have to map all your stakeholders that are affected by the project. You have to think about what are the intended but also unintended consequences for them, and you convene them, you consult them to make sure their feedback is addressed, their concerns are addressed, and that this feedback from the stakeholders is also informing the design of the project. And we apply this approach to every project and investment that we are investing into, and it's coming a little bit back while like the others said, it's sometimes we have to be mindful of scaling, replicating projects, knowing that they can be highly contextual and need to take into consideration local. There is a process and approach that we can use at least to make sure that we address some of the issues that we face, and also then take appropriate measures to address it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we hear quite a lot in adaptation, is that there's a data gap for adaptation, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to put such an emphasis on a stakeholder participatory approach to doing the framework, was a way to fill this data gap by combining scientific evidence with local stakeholder community knowledge as well to get the best results into the design of a project. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll try and round it up a little bit, but I hope that sort of based on this webinar, everyone can understand why Gold Standard have developed an adaptation framework and why we're working on nature-based solutions as well. But it'd be great to get just one sentence from each of you on, we've talked quite a lot about the risks and the barriers, but also it'd be great to just see what's the main driver for you all on applying an integrated logic to a project or portfolio. if anyone, Charles, do you mind kicking us off?
Sure. It's pretty much for all the reasons we've discussed on this call, that it's a complex web of different stakeholders, different geographies and topographies and ecosystems at play, along with when you start overlaying other different political regimes and social regimes on it, which mandates us to have, to John, Sundar, and Natalie's point of light, a more system approach and system change approach, which will fundamentally help us enable a behavioral change at a mass level. And that's going to take time and effort and money.
Great, thank you. Sundar, do you mind going next?
Absolutely. Thank you firstly for this opportunity. I genuinely believe that nature-based solutions have a huge role to play in addressing some of the big challenges for societies and the planet. And this can only be done in a collaborative way across the ecosystem of stakeholders. And we've got to do this in the right way with the right investment for the future of this planet and for our people.
Thank you. Natalie?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Chair and Sundar have said, I think let's not forget about, like how we frame it in terms of what does it mean for the people, for the animal, the species, like how we frame it. It seems complex, but we also have to make sure we're talking about securing, like addressing food security, addressing power needs, addressing health issues that all have consequences on real lives. So let's make sure we take the systems approach, holistic approach, and frame it in a way that people can grasp it.
Great, thank you. And John, finally, last but not least.
Yeah, we need to keep plugging away. This is not an issue that is going to disappear or be sidelined. It is only growing in sense of importance. And we have a lot to learn. Sundar said before, it's relatively new. So keep plugging away, keep learning, keep sharing, keep trying and testing, and don't believe that you suddenly find the Holy Grail. Anyone that says you have found the Holy Grail is lying. We will not, but we can plug away, we can learn from each other, and ultimately we can get it right. And we have to. It's not going to go away.
Of course, yeah, echo all of that, and just want to say thank you all for lending your time, being such a lovely panel, having a great discussion, and thank you to everyone who's joined as well. And if you would like to get involved in piloting the gold standard RCC adaptation framework, please do get in touch. We'll also be doing a call potentially at some point for NbS pilots to co-design and create what is the best, and NbS can be bearing in mind things like trade-offs, maladaptation, context specifics. So yeah, look out for that as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining and participating in the discussion. I had a great time, so I hope everyone else did as well.
Thank you for organising it.
Thank you.
No
Thank
worries.
you so much.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.